Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on who was Rosa Parks. This lesson is going to be really useful for you if you're year 7 to year 9 and you're looking at the civil rights movement in the USA, the struggle against racism and for racial equality for black people under law. Now, slightly unusually for one of these lessons, I'm not starting with the title slide today. We're going to get right to that. But first, I would just like us to have a little look at this quote from the American rapper Jay-Z. I'm just going to give you a moment to read it and then we will discuss it. So if you need to pause the video here, that's fine. So here's what he says. I need you all to be really, really quiet for this. I need you to really understand what I'm telling you. Rosa Parks sat so Martin Luther King could walk. Martin Luther King walked so Obama could run. Obama's running so we all can fly. What does he mean by that? Again, pause the video here, maybe bullet point down some ideas, and then we'll discuss. Well, what he's saying is each of these figures in turn has rolled the ball further in terms of black rights in America. So Rosa Parks begins it by sitting so that Martin Luther King can walk, can take things even further. Martin Luther King taking things even further enables Barack Obama, to become the first black president of the USA. And Barack Obama doing that potentially opens up the door to even greater liberation of black people and even greater realization of those long goals of racial equality in the US. But it all starts there in this quote with Rosa Parks, and she is going to be the object of today's lesson. So what you're going to want to do is get yourself a pen and paper and write down this title, Who was Rosa Parks? You're also going to want to get down these keywords and their definitions. So if you need to pause here, that's fine. What I'll now do is go over some of these definitions. So Rosa Parks herself, the woman from our title, she was a seamstress who refused to comply with segregation rules on the buses. If you're not sure what segregation means, that's a couple of keywords down. Next, we've got Claudette Colvin. She was a 15-year-old girl who actually did the exact same thing some months before Rosa Parks, I think about 9 months, if I've got that right. And it's just less well known. But she too did the same thing. And in some ways, perhaps showed even greater bravery by doing it at a younger age. Then our third keyword is segregation. So what this was a set of laws and rules in the USA which forced white and black people to have separate access to services like transports, obviously the buses here in this case, and education. So black and white children, black and white students would have to attend different schools. But it also extended out to all sorts of different areas of life, like drinking fountains, churches, and so on. Next, we've got boycott. That's going to be really important in the second part of the lesson. And a boycott is when you refuse to participate in something. So say if you and everyone in your class stopped buying Mars bars, you'd be boycotting Mars bars, refusing to buy them. And then lastly, we've got the word lynching. And that's the word given to the killing of black people by mobs, especially in the southern states of the USA. That was where lynching was particularly prevalent. Okay, so what are our destination questions today? Well, there are two. Number one, obviously, we're going to try and answer who was Rosa Parks and what did she do? And then number two, we're going to try and say how successful the Montgomery bus boycott was, which is something that happened as a result of what Rosa Parks did. So if we're successful, we'll be able to do those two things by the end of this lesson. So we're going to start with a song. Now, this is a song from 1939, but it continued to be popular and sung by its artist for some decades later. And the song is called Strange Fruit. So let's have a little look at some of the lyrics. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. What do you think this means? Again, pause the video here, bullet point down any ideas that you have. So if you guess that it's to do with our final keyword, lynching, then you're correct. And that's pictured there. I realize that may be a shocking and upsetting image, but it is important to confront the reality of what took place in America at that time. So Billie Holiday, a black singer, decided that she wanted to sort of memorialize these people in a song. And that's where she came up with Strange Fruit, this metaphor for the hanging of black bodies from trees in the southern US states. And the reason I show this to you is to give you an idea of just how serious this was. This was not an issue of manners or the sort of polite separation of black and white people. This was brutal violence carried out against black people in the USA for many, many years. And that is what they were up against, and that's what they were fighting. Just before we move on from Billie Holiday, I wanted to add one little extra fact in about her. So because of this song, she was actually later hounded by a senior leader in the FBI called Harry Anslinger, who instructed her to stop singing it. He did not want lynching sung about in this way, and she refused. And so he made it the sort of goal of his career almost to really hound and harass Billie Holiday. So something worth knowing there. Now, onto a little bit of this segregation that I mentioned in the third keyword. So you may have seen in some of our other lessons on Satchel about this, but let's do a reminder. Have a look at this image. You can probably see straight away there are two signs there, two separate drinking fountains, one white and one coloured, which was a word that they used at the time to mean black people. And again, because of segregation, they were forced to use these different drinking fountains to stay separated from each other. This extended as well to leisure time. So things like theatres and cinemas were kept separate for white and black people. The idea was that they always needed to be separate because black people were inferior to, less than, white people in the US at this time. Here you can see it on transport. So you've got a coloured waiting room, a waiting room specifically for black people only, and then white people would sit elsewhere. And you had to stick to these rules. There were consequences and punishments if you did not. Another example here. So have a look at that sign. We want white tenants in our white community. So if you were a black family looking to move into a particular neighborhood, you had to consider whether you would effectively be chased out or ostracized in that neighborhood or bullied by the local white population. And in many cases, that would happen. Life would be made unbearable and intolerable for you if you tried to move in there. And they would go as far as to put up these blatant signs. You know, it wasn't all hidden. A great deal of it was, but some of it was right out in the open. And they would come out with signs like this. We want white tenants in our white community. There's no room for black people to move in here. So all the time, there's this constant message that you're not liked, you're not welcome, and you're not equal to us. So let's get to the buses then. So on the buses, black people were made to sit in the back rows of the bus, as you can see on the diagram here. And white people would take the 4 front rows down at the front of the bus. However, if the rows were full, so far we've just talked about separation and segregation. If all the front rows were full, then the black passengers had to give up their seats. They were expected to stand or to get off the bus in order to allow more white people to sit down on that bus. So those were the rules of segregation, not just separate, but separate and inferior to, separate and less than. So the story of Rosa Parks in relation to this. Well, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, who's pictured there, she was travelling home on the buses from a day working as a seamstress. And she, as you were supposed to, took her seat, which was labelled for coloured people. So she's in the black section of the bus, effectively, so far doing what she's been told to do. She's following the rules of segregation. However, after a few stops of the bus, the seats started to fill up. So can you remember what they were supposed to do if the seats filled up? Just pause here, see if you can remember. So if you said black people were expected to give up their seats for white people, then you've got it right. This was what was expected of Rosa Parks in this moment. She was expected to give up her seat. So you can see here an example of the segregated bus. However, when a white man got on that bus, the bus driver insisted that Rosa Parks and 3 other passengers on her row would have to give up their seats according to the normal rules. But Rosa Parks famously refused. And you've got to think, this might seem minor. It might seem like a small act to just stay sitting down in your bus seat, but this was unheard of at the time in the USA. This was a shocking act of resistance to rules that were considered completely unbreachable. Rosa Parks refused. What do you think happened to her? Have a look at this picture. See if you can figure it out. So if you said she got arrested, then you're absolutely right. This is her police mugshot holding up her crime number there. So Rosa Parks was actually arrested and tried on charges of disorderly conduct for refusing to get out of her seat for the white passengers, just for standing up for her own right to stay in her seat on the bus. Okay, let's do a quick knowledge check then on the story of Rosa Parks so far. So question 1, can you describe how buses were segregated in the USA during the 1950s? Question 2, what did black passengers have to do if the bus was full? Question 3, what did Rosa Parks do? And question 4, what happened to Rosa Parks as a result of what she did? So if you need to pause the video here and get down your answers, that is fine. Use full sentences. So if you look back at this work later on, you'll know what you were talking about. And then on the next slide, we're going to check our answers. Okay, here we go. So question 1, how were the buses segregated? Well, there was a section for the white passengers down at the front and a section for the black passengers at the back. And they were expected to stay separate at all times. Question 2, what did the black passengers have to do if the bus got full? Well, they had to give up their seats for white passengers, either stand or get off the bus. Question 3, what did Rosa Parks do? Nice and simple. She refused to give up her seat. She would not play that game. And question 4, what happened to her as a result of her refusal? She was arrested for disorderly conduct and became a sort of hero of the civil rights movement as a result of this. Now, I just want to briefly mention Claudette Colvin, who's pictured here. So as we saw in our keywords, she was the 15-year-old who did this some months before Rosa Parks. She did the same thing, refused to get out of her seat when the bus got full. And she too was thrown in jail, actually into an adult cell, terrified the entire time by the police as a result of what she'd done. When she was eventually released, she recalls that the whole family spent the night awake and in terror, with her dad by the door with a shotgun, because they are worried about a group called the KKK, who you may have heard before, an extremist, violent, racist group in the US who were famous for their role in lynchings, the hunting down and killing of black people in the US. And they were worried that because of what Claudette had done, there would be those revenge attacks against her. There weren't in the end, but it shows you again the level of fear and tension that existed over these issues at the time in the US. Now, on to our second destination question, which was about the Montgomery bus boycott. This was what happened as a result of what Rosa Parks did. So Parks' actions sparked a boycott, which means an avoidance or a refusal to participate in something, of all the buses in Montgomery by the African-American population, by the black population. Throughout that boycott movement, it was often led by Martin Luther King, who we will have heard of before. He was leading those protests and the boycott movement against segregation on the Montgomery buses. Now, that was really, really effective. All the African-American population refusing to go on the buses, boycotting them, was very, very effective, because that was 60 to 70% of the bus company's customer base. And so if you think about it, what are they losing out on? They're losing out on the fares. They're losing out on the money that would have been handed into the buses that now isn't, because more than half of their customer base have gone. And so it hit them in the profits. It was a really, really effective method for them to use. Eventually, the courts decided that the segregated nature of Montgomery's buses was unconstitutional. That means it's against the rules of the American Constitution, the sort of founding rules of the whole country as a whole. And so the court orders that the buses must be desegregated. They must now allow the mixing of the sections and for buses to be used in a way that we would recognise more today. So what that boycott demonstrated was that there was a lot of economic power when all of them worked together. They were able, as we discussed just now, to really, really impact the profits of the bus companies by all acting together and using their economic power. It also highlighted the effectiveness of non-violence. So there were debates within the civil rights movement, and there are other lessons up on Satchel that you can look at on this, about whether to use physical resistance, direct action, and violence, or whether to keep it peaceful at all times. And Martin Luther King was certainly advocating peaceful methods were superior. And the Montgomery bus boycott was sort of an argument in his favour. It was proof in at least one instance that peaceful resistance could work. However, that said, we've got to be careful. It didn't totally get rid of segregation. So white-only restaurants and theatres still existed in Montgomery and across all the southern states. So it's not like segregation was over with the snap of the fingers. Yes, the buses were desegregated, but there was still a long way to go in a lot of other areas of life in that struggle for racial equality. Okay, final knowledge check of the lesson then. So a few questions to answer. Number one, what did Rosa Parks' actions lead to? Not quite sure we've got the double question mark there. Number two, who helped to lead that movement? Number three, why was that movement so effective? What made it work? And number four, were there any limitations of the movement that you can remember? So just take a moment to pause here like we did before, get your answers down in full sentences, and then we'll check our answers on the next slide. Okay, so Rosa Parks' actions, they led to the Montgomery bus boycott. Number two, the Montgomery bus boycott was led in large part by Martin Luther King. Number three, why was the boycott so effective? Why did it work? Well, it was because black people made up 60 to 70% of the passenger fares on the buses. And so it really hurt the bus companies and brought a lot of attention, therefore, onto what they were doing. And number four, what were the limitations of the bus boycott and of peaceful, non-violent resistance? Well, segregation continued in other ways. Yes, they won on the buses, but it was only a partial victory. They hadn't totally overthrown segregation in other areas of society and other parts of the country. Okay, final task for today. I would like you to write a speech as though you were a civil rights activist promoting the Montgomery bus boycott. So someone involved in this at the time, fighting for racial equality and pushing for the bus boycott. In your speech, you're going to explain why the boycott is needed and why it will be so effective. And then if you're feeling confident with that, there's a stretch and challenge task for you. Are there any other methods that aren't boycotts that you could think of that would help in the struggle for racial equality? If you can think of them, then include them in your speech as well. So pause the video here, write your speech out, and then we will finish off. Okay, well done on that, guys. So let's just close on this note. A picture of Rosa Parks at an older age there. And a nice quote from her. My message to the world is that we must come together and live as one. So that was what she stood for. That was what she fought for. And that's what she inspired lots of other people to fight for in their lives. Just to sum up, let's remind ourselves of where we've been. We've been asking the question, who was Rosa Parks and what did she do? And we've considered how successful the Montgomery bus boycott was. So if you've been doing the work and following along in this lesson, you should now be able to answer those questions. Thank you for listening and good luck with the rest of your courses.